the flooding that would occur if you had sea level rise, current, normal high tide, and storm surge. So you'd get a 2.9 meter increase. It would flood this small island here called Westham Island, and you would start to see breaches in the dike. The thing is, though, that this is just farmland right now. You also have to remember that development choices may change what that land looks like. So here's current land use in Suwasan. Here's what it could look like if there was sprawl. And here's what it could look like if there was densification with some biofuels. Now what happens if you combine that sea level rise scenario with this? Is anyone in the city thinking about that yet? That these development choices, made because there's population pressures, there's development opportunities, the developers are knocking on the door, I can give you a lot of money. What if the sea level rise scenario happens over that instead of over this? Will it make a difference? Is anyone studying that? Is anyone putting out the dollars? Comparing the costs and benefits of these two development scenarios with a sea level rise? Has that happened yet? Is that part of best practice in the Planning Institute? Again, it's not climate science anymore. It's development choices, future focused, but maybe you can take advantage of these kinds of tools to set up those kinds of exercises. That might be another way of mainstreaming climate change adaptation into these official community plans. So my colleague Libby Vizakova, who was thinking about this, trying to come up with a way of getting climate change adaptation into sustainable development planning and including mitigation in this, started off with really a very simple idea of community planning. Say you're starting off with a pilot project. You're asking questions about where we're heading. You're estimating the impacts of changing climate. You're putting out a vision of a preferred development path, what might be a sustainability path. The where do we want to go, which is identifying responses to climate change, but also identifying future development priorities, and then identifying the actions to implement the responses and the synergies between those responses to climate change, and then a follow-up to start this. There's been no opportunity to actually do one of these yet, but there's a little scoping project underway in Richmond right now, so I hope we'll learn something from that experience. The role of the practitioner or the stakeholder in here is going to depend very much on what level they are engaged. Are they at a low level? They're just involved in the giving of information? Are they just involved in consultation? Or are they more functional participants? Assist in meeting predetermined objectives? Are they at an interactive level? Are they initiating something with external advice? Or are they actually gotten to the point where they can be a catalyst for change? This figure comes from a book that has been produced by the United Nations Environment Program led by Bo Lim. And I mean, when I look at what the Columbia Basin Trust is doing, they're up here now. Pretty impressive for a small regional group doing a stakeholder initiative with external advice. Because again, it's their initiative and it's their funds. I think there are a number of other communities, groups that we can probably point to that have gotten up here to mainstream adaptation and climate change. And indeed, eventually, they will make it up to the top point where they are actually a catalyst for change. So in the search for a good choreography, I feel you need to find a starting point. In my case, it was a biophysical indicator that is well understood by the practitioners. You want to talk water management? You show anyone a hydrograph, they'll know what you're talking about right away. Doesn't matter if they're a civil engineer, a fruit grower, someone interested in fisheries. Many of the municipal councillors who work on water boards will understand that. That's a great conversation starter. There are other indicators like that that I think could be good conversation starters. And then determining trends and assess the scenarios of that particular indicator. You use this to create a dialogue on what if and so what. Does it make a difference to your vision of the future? Does it make a difference to your ability to balance objectives that you currently have as part of your professional responsibilities? And then use that to help build this collaborative team. So you explore both the scenarios as well as the past and current experiences. Even in a scenario first approach, you don't ignore the past. The past is now looked at with a different lens, perhaps. But your knowledge of the past is just as important to a scenario first approach than into a vulnerability assessment. And hopefully what this does is it moves the dialogue from strictly the damage report Because I think collectively as a community, the research community has a little bit of experience now in doing the damage report. But to be able to move from this to actually talking mainstream, this is the barrier that we're facing. But I think we can do this. And then we can use this to then turn back to the current systems and review them. Say, will they stand up? In the case of the Ahead of the Storm study in Toronto, they created an internal mechanism for an adaptation process. They have an adaptation steering group, issue-based working groups. They have a stakeholder engagement process. They're looking at incorporating adaptations into a whole range of city policies and plans. Wet weather flow master plan, hot weather response plan, green development standard, and so on. They're assessing local climate change and its impacts through identifying vulnerabilities and conducting risk assessments. They're identifying and assessing adaptation options to reduce risk. And they eventually intend to develop and implement those things. Plus monitoring and adjust the strategies when necessary. This is all part of their Ahead of the Storm plan. Final thoughts. I love this cartoon because it says so much about what we face. You know, a lot of people still think that they're at the dry end of the boat. That means we're fine. If we're going to get past the main barriers of getting climate change mainstreamed into the on-the-ground decisions that are made by municipal governments, provincial governments, businesses, professional associations, other stakeholders, and then ultimately filter up to the international level, we have to start thinking about this in a more systematic way, more holistic way. We won't be able to do this if we can't cross the boundaries between the various disciplines and between the research community and the practitioner community, local knowledge holders. We have to find ways to do that better, and we have to get more institutional investment to sustain this long enough for it to bear fruit. If the institutions do not invest of themselves, then we will be forced to continue to be opportunists, and the risk of loss of institutional memory continues to be high. This has to be sustained. Can't always be one-year contracts. But how do we convince that level of decision-making to change how they govern this work? So my point about choreography. There are different choreographies. They offer different opportunities. The choice will depend on a number of things, such as, does the community you're in have previous experience or not? If they do have previous experience, I think they'll be ready to plunge into a scenario-first exercise. We need to find an entry point for climate information in all of these tools, the medium. In some cases, it's pretty easy. In other cases, it's a lot harder. Try to get climate change into a timber supply model. Not easy. They weren't designed for that. But now that they've become aware of their vulnerability as a result of the mountain pine beetle, they're beginning to think about the steps needed to do this. But there'll be other opportunities, certainly, in areas like drought and wind and snow load, cooling demand. Utilities know very well what their relationships are with temperature. So finding ways to get this into their tools in an explicit way. Interestingly enough, the insurance industry has their own catastrophe risk models, but they're proprietary. They're not shared very much. And so to see how climate change would affect a catastrophe risk model output is a challenge. So that's going to be one of these other barriers, because they're still in a competitive market. Now, climate modelers are busy exchanging their code all the time. I don't know if insurance companies exchange their catastrophe risk model codes all the time. Unlikely. And yet this may be one of the things that gets in the way of having a coordinated insurance response to dealing with changes in climate statistics. Which brings up my final point, which is we've got to find more of these opportunities for shared learning. Explore applications of new kinds of tools, such as these decision models and visualizations I showed you. And all of this, I say, can include dialogue with local knowledge. I think the group-based model we did explicitly included local knowledge. I think there are a lot of other opportunities where that can occur as well. Here's where you can find more information on the Okanagan work. There was a special issue of Climate Policy that talked about the AMSD projects. This is the Journal of Climate Policy. There is a new website that Environment Canada has launched called hazards.ca, which has information about extreme event climate information, and a new scenario on climate change scenarios for the country as a whole, which we hope will be complementary to the regional sites like the one operated here by PICIC, and the one in Quebec. This is called cccss.ca. Thank you.